Okay, so in the last video we instantiated the two fire effects. Now we need to remove them once their time has expired, and we need to destroy the barrel, because so far you really haven't functionally accomplished anything yet. You've just instantiated the visual effects. You haven't actually removed the obstacle. So let's go ahead, right click, choose create, and choose C# script, and let's just call it self destroy. Or you could call it self-destruct, whatever. As long as you're choosing a name that is descriptive. So now what we want to do is we're going to click on the glow prefab, and then you're going to drag and drop that script onto it. Click on the burst prefab, and again drag and drop the script onto it. Also, another way to do it, it's a little bit finicky about where you drag and drop it. You can choose add component, and if you choose script, that's the pre-existing scripts, so you can add it either way. Now what we're going to do is, within that self-destroy script, because it's attached to two different objects, in this case particle systems, and they have different destruct times, we need to look at the name of the object this is attached to. So if GameObject dot name double equal sign glow clone, because if you recall, the object when instantiated gets instantiated with the word clone appended to it. So this is glow, and so when it gets instantiated, it gets instantiated as glow clone. Actually, let's quickly run that in case you didn't see it. So we click, see how it says clone next to the name, and clone next to the name. So if you just do the name of the prefab, this won't work. So if the GameObject.name is equal to glow clone, then destroy GameObject. Now, if you leave it as just this, it destroys it immediately, and that's what we don't want. We want there to be a delay. We said that it's going to glow for 2 seconds. So that second argument is optional, but in our case it's required. So just using the destroy statement in general, you don't need the second argument. But in this case we do. We want there to be a 2-second delay. Now we can just copy and paste this. Oops. And we just change this from glow to burst. And I believe that runs for 0.3 of a second. Good, drop in the F since it is a decimal. We save that. So now they should destroy in those corresponding amount of time. And while we're here, let's go to the Firestarter script. If you recall, Firestarter is attached to the barrel. And so since we already have the 2-second timer right here, then we can just drop in destroy GameObject. And as I mentioned a few seconds ago, in this case we don't want that second argument because we've already waited the 2 seconds. So that should be all it takes. So glows, bursts, and now the barrel is destroyed. So now you've actually accomplished something. Now you have destroyed an obstacle. And if you notice up here, none of the objects are there anymore. Part of the prefab particle systems are not there, nor is the barrel. You've actually removed an obstacle from the player. So this doesn't necessarily have to be used as a the barrel isn't necessarily being used as a weapon. You're just destroying it to get it out of your way. And if you want, you can leave it like that if that's what you're trying to do. However, if you want the explosion to actually impact the surrounding objects, we can do that too. What we need to use is a new component known as an area effector, and we actually need to use two. We're going to use one for vertical and one for horizontal, and what we're going to do is we're going to just stack a couple barrels so you can see how it affects them. So let's go up to Game Object and choose Create Empty. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to actually attach two separate, we're going to create two additional objects and attach it to this one, because area effectors you can only have one per object, and we need two different ones. So unfortunately that means we have to make this a little more complicated than we'd really like to. So what we're going to do is we're going to create two more objects. Call this push up. Call this push left. And we'll just call this burst force. So what's going on is this object is really just to allow for these two other objects to be attached to it. So rather than trying to instantiate this and this and trying to instantiate the right locations, you just attach them to another object, and then all you have to do is instantiate this one object correctly. So if you want to do these separately, you could, but I think you're going to just create a lot of extra work for yourself, so it's easier just to create this kind of holding object for them. It's going to be their parent. So what we want to do is, for the push up, we're going to go Add Component. We're going to choose Physics 2D, and we're going to choose Box Collider, and we're going to choose Add Component. We're going to choose Physics 2D again, but this time we choose the scroll down Area Effector 2D. Now in the box cloud, you notice this checkbox here, used by effector. It needs to be that, and it needs to be a trigger. By default, the force angle is 0. That's actually pushing to the right. So we need to rotate it up. You can't just rotate the object, you actually have to change the angle. And magnitude kind of speaks for itself as far as how much force do you want applied. This is all going to be kind of hit or miss. You might have several different size of explosions, so you might have to change the magnitude depending on the magnitude of the explosion. Drag, it affects if there's any resistance to that force. And the force target right now is the rigid body. This makes a difference as to whether or not you want the object to spin, because you have two choices. You have rigid body and you have collider. So what we're going to do is going to take this and we're going to make it a child to the burst force. Okay, so we need to move it up. Now let's take this and highlight it, or it's not highlight, I'm sorry. We're going to center it around the barrel, because that's where it's going to instantiate. So right now, push force is really not appearing where we want it to appear. Let's go ahead and push that up. Much better. And now push left. Let's also make that a child. And go ahead and do the same thing that we did with push up. I suppose we could have just copied push up, but since this is a new functionality, I kind of want to go through it a few times. So Physics 2D, Box Collider, Trigger used by effector, Add Component, Physics 2D, scroll down, Area Effector, and this time the force angle needs to be 180 because you need to continue to rotate it. Again, put in the magnitude, and so like I said, you can either try to instantiate these individually, which like I said gets messy where you're trying to determine exactly where it should appear, or you can just attach them to this object, and that way it makes it easier because now you're just instantiating one object, and since this object is going to be centered on the barrel, you can just use the barrel's location. So it makes the instantiation much easier. So almost done. Let's go ahead and turn that into a prefab. And as I was saying, the reason why we can't just attach the effectors to the burst itself is because you can only have one effector per object. Now, technically what you could do is you could also have the burst be part of the burst force. So we can look at that in a minute, but we kind of painted ourselves into a corner here, so let's just follow through with this and then we can clean it up a bit. And often that's how game design is. You get something that functionally works and then you optimize. So what we need to do is we need to have the barrel to now be aware want to be able to distinguish between which one's the object and which one is just the variable. So we'll call it burst force object. So now the barrel's aware of it. So just go ahead and drag and drop it onto that. And we now need it to instantiate. So just as this instantiates the fire burst, this is therefore where we also want the burst forced object to instantiate, and we want to use transform dot position, but we want to use burst force rotation. So that should work. So now what we need to do is we need to add a couple obstacles to actually be knocked around. So they need add component, physics 2D, so add rigid body 2D, and we'll leave everything in its default settings. In physics 2D, and we'll add polygon collider. Actually what we'll do is we'll just delete the second barrel and just copy this one since I want all the same settings. So if everything's working alright, these should now get knocked around. We have to make one change though. This barrel is a trigger. So you can actually add multiple colliders to the same object. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a second one. We'll make it a box collider. That way it now has like a solid frame around it. That way things can stack on top of it. And now characters can't walk through it. The only thing that doesn't happen is the area effector does not disappear. So we'll have to add that in too, but let's just see if this is working. Very nice, things are getting blown around. See how it's bouncing? Because it's still there. So let's just go ahead and add that in, and the way we'll do that is we'll have the burst force. We'll also have the self-destroy script, and we can just modify one line in that. Now what we can do, we can either do a new game object, or since we want it to be timed the same as burst clone, we can just put it in here. So either way, you can either do, you can just copy and paste and change this to, we called it what, burst force. So you can either just copy and paste and change it. It uses the same timing, or what you could do is you could append the check here. So this would be GameObject.name equals burst force and GameObject.name equals burst. So you can check for both in one line. We'll just leave it like this though. See, now it's no longer there. But things really don't spin around. So let's make one final change and then I think we will be done. So let's go to our burst force object. Let's go to our push up and let's change that to collider, and push left, change to collider. If everything works as intended, they should start spinning now. If not, no big deal. Yeah, see, they're spinning now. At least that one is. This one isn't because it's on a flat surface. So that should about do it. You now have an object that can be destroyed and be used as a weapon because there's force. So maybe there's a person hiding behind it, or maybe there's someone standing in front of it. You would have to do additional programming as far as having that person, maybe when they get hit, they get changed into a different animation. But that really does it. You now have the ability to have an object work like a weapon using a telekinetic skill, or in this case rather a pyrokinetic skill. So if there's anything else you want added to it, just let me know.